Welcome to this My Dying Bride album ranking. In 30 years, My Dying Bride released 14 studio albums. I don't list Evinta from 2011 because this was an album that would make an interesting solo album or side project, but doesn't really fit into the My Dying Bride discography. Therefore, my countdown starts with number 13. Still, it was a difficult task because fans' opinions on which My Dying Bride albums are the best are widely different. When you're ranking Slayer, it's a no-brainer to put Rain in Blood in the top 3. Everybody loves Rain in Blood. But reading reviews from other fans for My Dying Bride albums, what someone calls his favorite album is the least favorite of another. Let's see what I can do. You may remember Kerry from the Overkill album ranking we did last year. Today she makes a special effort with the album cover presentation. I'm grateful for her contribution. When My Dying Bride fans discuss the albums of the band and someone mentions he doesn't like 34%, he oftentimes gets replies like, you just don't get it. But there are good reasons to dislike this album. My Dying Bride were always a band outside of any trends, creating their own realm of doom and darkness. This record, however, shows the typical 90s industrial influences so many bands at the time experimented with. That makes the experimental aspects a lot less inventive. The sound effects on Aaron's voice oftentimes take away something rather than adding to it. Mind you, it's complicated to puzzle a song like Heroin Chick together with the vocal layers, percussion elements and so on, so the artistic effort is certainly there, but it's not what I want to hear from My Dying Bride. Sometimes nostalgia makes you place a debut too high in a ranking, but in this case I took into consideration that I didn't play it a lot anymore in recent years. I followed My Dying Bride from the start, owned the Sympathy EP already and had a copy of the Towards the Sinister demo tape, so I pretty much knew what to expect when As the Flower Withers was released. The vocals still consisted of death metal growls only, which made it a bit monotonous. At the end of the album, however, with the return of the beautiful, coming events cast their shadows before. After the experiments of the 34% album, My Dying Bride went back to the old band logo and familiar sounds. The Light at the End of the World is an okay album, but not among the best. Listening to a song like The Fever Sea, for example, you think they did the same thing better already. Deafness Kings is a mixed bag. My favorite track is the 9-minute L'amour détruit. On the other hand, I don't care much for Love's Intolerable Pain or the 34% throwback One of Beauty's Daughters. Some good points, but none of my faves. One of the more subtle or gentle albums of the band. My favorite track is the doomy Santuario di Sangue. Is there anything wrong with For Lies I Sire that I don't put it higher in my ranking? Yes and no. There are no obvious flaws, but maybe it's a little undecided. For example, they reintroduced the violin on this album after some years' absence, but it never becomes as vital as on the early albums. Then there'd been a change of rhythm section since the previous album. Maybe the new lineup was not as tight and confident as the guys before and after. It's hard to define what this album lacks, but it isn't My Dying Bride at 100% of what they're capable of. After the longest break ever between two albums, the band returns with music which is not as dark and melancholic. Aaron said in an interview, it feels like a second start, a new debut album, and indeed it has something different. The violin never sounded as sweet before as it does in To Outlive the Gods. The female lead vocals in The Solace make them sound like a folk band. I'm not sure yet if I like the direction the band is taking. Ask me again in a couple of years. Between 2010 and 15, there were a couple of years where I didn't listen much to My Dying Bride. Feel the Misery revived my interest in the band. It is not exactly back to the roots as the rock and roll cliché goes, but it turned up the energy in songs like To Shiver in Empty Halls or Within a Sleeping Forest. After The Wreckage of My Flesh, an opener in best My Dying Bride tradition, the album consists mostly of more intimate songs like My Wine in Silence and A Doomed Lover. Following a more powerful album like The Dreadful Hours, Songs of Darkness is a good example how variety within the My Dying Bride concept works. You probably too had some people say My Dying Bride recorded 10 albums and they all sound the same. They need to listen closer. The DVD from the tour Sina Morata shows on one hand that My Dying Bride had plenty of good new material. They played a lot from Songs of Darkness and Dreadful Hours, while only 3 old songs survived in the setlist. On the other hand, the violin is seriously missed in the live shows, actually more than on vinyl. There are excellent lyrics here in songs like Hail Odysseus and Abandoned as Christ, and Aaron is speaking more often than singing on this record. Musically, A Map of All Our Failures is a bit hard to digest at first. When you are new to My Dying Bride, this is not the album you should start with. You might find it too long or even boring. On the other hand, if you always liked this kind of stuff, you'll find it one of the Bride's most conclusive releases. The 4th studio album was more melodic. Songs like For You and A Kiss to Remember were the most accessible material composed by the band so far. I filmed the band on the tour for this album. You'll find some live songs on my channel. There's also a rare interview from those days. After the end of the 90s had been a bit disappointing, the band opened the 2000s with this much more impressive release. The Raven and the Rose, for example, is a really brutal track, even with some death metal blast beats, but played with a sensitivity which distinguishes My Dying Bride from others. My Hope, the Destroyer, is among my favorite tracks, showing the development which took place since Gods of the Sun. Whenever I make an album ranking, I'm not only aiming at the fans who've got all the albums and like to compare my list to their own. I think such a ranking is especially helpful to people who got 2, 3, 4 albums of the band but are not familiar with everything the band released in the decades of their long career. For these occasional listeners, this video might provide some recommendations which albums you should check out if you miss them, and The Dreadful Hours is surely one of them. The second studio album was the one which made me a fan. The previous releases were interesting, but this one awesome. Songs like Songless Bird or Crown of Sympathy were complex, fascinating, included more clean vocals now, and you really had the impression that this band boldly goes where no one went before.
And you better believe it.
The Cry of Mankind, with its impressive video, was a kind of breakthrough for My Dying Bride, I guess. Occasionally MTV was good for something. From Darkest Skies is a different beast, very heavy and menacing. Black Voyage deserves the Doom label. It slowly absorbs you. It's all about the atmosphere until at the end the violin reappears to bring it to a conclusion. Your Shameful Heaven opens with a melancholic solo but evolves into the fastest song of the album. Amazing stuff. Metal journalists created the belief that the third album of a band decides whether you make it or break it, so the timing was right. Since the sound of The Angel and the Dark River was not as raw as on the early recordings, I'm sure that the band began to attract more people also from outside the metal scene. That's something I don't always appreciate, but since the doom metal scene is dedicated but small, It helped My Dying Bride to cross the borderlines while surely never sounding so simple that anyone could call them commercial. Thanks for watching.